Good morning, everyone, for the last time. Okay, so I will simply say that it is not common for me to have to be tethered to a podium. So we're going to try to make this happen as cleanly as possible for you and for me. So let's get started. Reclaiming the narrative of the Civil War. That's what they asked me to talk about. Well, before I jump into that, let me just say this. We have an issue in our nation, and it's not new, where we are far more comfortable looking at history through these remarkably tinted glasses. And our institutions are equally responsible for what is known as a national narrative. They are comforting. They are often designed to bring us together around a common goal or an idea. And the problem too often is, in order to get this nice, neat package, is that we really leave out the real complexity of the story. We ultimately will leave out the players who are vital to that story. In other words, we often will leave women and people of color out of those stories. I tell people all the time, listen, perfect example. Most of us probably heard at some time in our lives that George Washington could not tell a lie and that in fact he had wooden teeth. Raise your hand if you've heard this before. And you would be wrong. But what happens when we begin to understand that absolutely he told a lie? Number one, he's a human being. Number two, he chose to be a military man and had to push men into fighting some pretty horrid situations. He became a president who had to manage people like Jefferson and Madison and Hamilton. Oh, and he had 300 plus slaves at Mount Vernon. And those teeth of his, well, they actually came from enslaved people. Dentures made by his French doctor, made of the teeth of the enslaved. Now, what would that say if we knew that story, that that was a part of this complexity that we're talking about? What happens? Right. Silence. I'll tell you what happens. Why are you destroying our history? Just ask our friends down there at Mount Vernon or Monticello. They've really been having some fun times, right? This is a challenge for us. And as museum educators, this challenge is one that we are asked to navigate in an environment that isn't always open to it. See, those of us on the front lines of this work, and whether you are interacting with visitors every day or whether you are interacting with board members and donors, you are interacting with people every day. And what you are having to deal with, and this is, if you haven't read Dr. Christine Barron's work, please do. What you are dealing with is this confluence between history, heritage, and memory. History is what actually happened, what the historical record has left us. That heritage piece is what people have chosen to tell themselves. And then that memory piece is how it made them feel the first time they were there. And let me tell you, working in the Civil War, good Lord. It is something that has really helped me understand this dynamic more than ever. So when we made the decision in 2013 to merge two museums together, create a new institution with a new mission and a new goal, people thought we were either the smartest folks in the room or absolutely nuts. Well, we'll let you figure it out. So the first thing is we had to acknowledge in making our, let's make sure, okay, so we had to make sure we understood the public, right? You know, we had anecdotal information. We know how people respond. And oh, by the way, let me tell you the two institutions that came together. That would help, right? American Civil War Center at Historic Tredegar opened in 2006, the first museum in the country to address the American Civil War from Union, Confederate, and African American perspectives under the same roof. 2006. Okay? The other partner was the Museum of the Confederacy, founded in 1896. That in the 1970s professionalized, meaning brought in real museum educators and professionals instead of the Ladies Confederate Memorial Literary Society. Professionalized in the 1970s and made the decision to become, against much resistance, to become a museum about the Confederacy instead of for it. But, you know, they had that name. And they had that past. And they had those members. But we all got together in 2013. So clearly, when we deal with a basic question of American understanding, hell, global understanding of the American Civil War, and you ask, what caused the Civil War? And people go, states' rights! Well, here's the thing. The people who lived at the time, that's not what they said. As a matter of fact, if you actually go through the Articles of Secession for each of the states, they're really clear about what the issues are. Really clear. Their issue was slavery. And when they had the vote in 1860, this is the vote that would lead to war because folks were so undone by this new Republican Party, okay, no relation to the one today, this new radical party that the left wing of the party wanted not only full emancipation and an abolition of slavery, but wanted full citizenship rights for not only Black men, but for everyone, men and women. That was the radical wing of the Republican Party. The more conservative end of the party was just wanting to stop the expansion of slavery. Just fix it where it is and don't let it expand any further. And then there was Lincoln, having to ride both of these sides, right? So in the election of 1860, America decides, well, part of America decides that when he wins, they're done. They're out. And several of us that are in this field, we may have seen this map time and time again. It's like this clear swath of sort of northern abolitionist fervor, don't believe it, and then this, you know, green of southern, and then these like states in the middle that just can't quite figure out what they want to do. When the reality of the lived experience was much more complex. This is reflective of the voting patterns for each of the counties in 1860. So this is what we decided to do, was to tell a richer, fuller story. And we had to start with, why do we have secession to begin with? And one of the key factors for us as we started looking at, and granted, none of this was new for us. I mean, scholars have been talking about this for the last 20 years, right? This is not new, but it's new to the public. In a lot of ways, there is always at least a 10-year gap between what academics tell us and inform us about and what eventually makes its way to the public. And then, if you're lucky, there's another 5 years before it even makes it into our museums. And that's unfortunate. So we're trying to figure out how to cut that cycle. But, you know, just in case you're curious, this particular chart shows you the order of secession based on population and the percentage of that population that was enslaved. You see a pattern there? Can you all see that? Okay, cool beans, all right. And then there's the Confederate Constitution itself, which makes very clear what they were doing and why, right? Okay, I'm just gonna go fast because, you know, we're already late and I'm trying to be sensitive to folks' time. So anyway, we also know that we had to address a really big cultural heritage movement that people are a part of whether they believe it or not. And it's referred to as the lost cause narrative. The lost cause narrative says, it was about states' rights. Lost cause narrative says, mind you, that essentially that black folks are basically were given freedom, right? Right, as a result of this war. Lost cause narrative says that everybody's noble, particularly, Confederate dudes, they're noble, defending their homes, defending their states against an invading Northern army. And the mothers of invention is a group of women that, yes, were referred to as the Confederate Memorial Literary Society. These were the daughters, wives, sisters of Confederate officers in most cases, Southern white elite, who in the post-Reconstruction era, when all of the advances and strides that have been made are reversed because Confederates were then allowed to get back their right to vote in 1876. And with that, the increase of the Southern Democratic and Northern Democratic parties. No relation to the current parties. Anyway, these women went about building monuments, north, south, east, or west, but mostly in the South. They were monument builders, and there's such amazing language on these things, and so much. Like this one. In memoriam, quote, no nation rose so white and fair, none fell so pure of crime, end quote. And then it happened into the school books. So CMLS and other organizations came together and formed formed the Daughters of the Confederacy. And these women had a historian whose name was Mildred Rutherford. And Mildred Rutherford set out throughout the late 1880s and into the early 20th century, made clear that they had to control the narrative about their past. They could not allow Northerners to depict them as traitors to their nation. So she had a whole book of rules that dictated any textbook or book otherwise that should be rejected as a textbook or a book in the libraries in the South. So if you ever wonder why people have very different perspectives, depending on where they grew up, it's because of the legacy of this. This lasted until the late 1970s. And what she said is, reject any book that refers to any Confederate as a traitor of the United States. Reject any book that says slavery was anything but benign and loving relationship. Reject any, I'm telling you, right? And they did. This is what we are up against. And again, we have a landscape that's full of this sort of reconciliatory language. We have some that are overtly racist and deemed okay because it's art, right? Here's another one of these monument, the inscriptions on one of the monuments. United States troops took over the state government and reinstated the usurpers. But the national election of November 1876 recognized white supremacy in the South and gave us our state. This is a placard in North Carolina. I'm sorry. No. This one is actually the one in New Orleans, one of the ones in New Orleans that was removed from Liberty Park. You see why people kind of wanted to get rid of these things? Every community can decide for itself. But at the end of the day, this is what people had been dealing with. If it's on the landscape, if it's reinforced, how can you ever have a clear reckoning, especially if you're a museum? And, and especially when you have what we refer to down south as the northern response, which is basically none. We won, we're done. We're the good guys, we're the great emancipators, yay, 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 yay. None of that is true, right? Because you see, the North didn't go to war to end slavery. The North initially goes to war to preserve the Union. So reunification post-war became a big theme. This is the way we could bring white America back together again. And as I said, one of the things that ends up happening is that emancipation is viewed somehow as a grand gift versus something that was ardently fought for and demanded by free Black and enslaved people and their allies at the time. This is the space that we were trying to continue the work of our institutions. But we knew we had to do it in new and innovative ways. And we knew we were doing it against the backdrop of popular culture that reinforced these ideas, whether it happened 100 plus years ago or whether it's happened in the last few decades. So how could we possibly get this right? Well, we had to set out, like any good program, you got to set out and talk about your goals. What is it that you want to accomplish? For us, we wanted to connect with today's audiences, acknowledging that people learn differently and we are in an environment of self-curated content. People do not have or fully understand or appreciate the importance of historic discipline, the discipline of scholarship. Instead, they go online and they start pulling resources to reinforce what they want versus what the compilation of the record tells us, right? That's a challenge. So we had to connect with we had to find those ways to connect quickly. We had to provide opportunities to challenge those broad myths. We had to engage visitors with our artifacts. And by the way, we have an extraordinary artifact collection. See, here's the thing. Museum of the Confederacy had a collection, an artifact collection alone, of over 30,000 pieces. Some of the most significant, it is regarded as the most significant collection of Civil War artifacts in private hands. For example, we have, I love this one. The Smithsonian made a big comment about how they have the largest collection of Civil War uniforms, right? And they said they had 27. And we giggled, because we have over 250. Okay? And most of these are given by the families themselves or were given by the United States government in 1905 during an exchange. The items that were given, of course, were things that were captured. Right? But see, here's the thing. When your mission is singularly focused, there are a whole slew of stories in your collection and the way that you look at your collection that are lost. When we came together and we started looking at what the collection actually told us, we learned quite a few things. The other thing that we wanted to do is we had to acknowledge that this was not simply Black or white, North or South. This was a story that had so many layers of complexity that we had to find a way to show just how fracturing the time was. And we also obviously wanted to modernize. When we hired our exhibit design firm and I sat down with them and they said, well, talk to us about your vision for all of this. And I said, well, I'm going to start off by telling you that I do not want to see what I see in every other museum, history museum. And number two, if you bring me a palette that includes tan, right? Or that funny blue or that ox blue, you know what I'm talking about. Because your museums probably have him, right? There's like this palette, this muted palette, this sepia tones, no, absolutely not. So they said, okay. Like I said, the collections itself allowed us to dig really deeply and find new stories in the mix. For example, we have over 500 battle flags in our collection. And yes, there was more than one type of Confederate battle flag, or regimental flags, and they all didn't look like this, okay? But here's the thing. Over half of them were flags that had been a part of that exchange in 1905 with the United States War Department. So as we dug into them, we realized that we had a flag for example, from the 49th Virginia Cavalry that had actually been captured by the 23rd USCT troops at the crater in Petersburg. I know none of this means anything to you at the moment. But it's a significant battle. And it was captured by black men. And so we now had a different story, and we had names. And we had artifacts in our collection from what the center had that allowed us to share that story of those men and what they did. But you see, this isn't just a story about military battles. It couldn't be remotely interesting for the diversity of audiences that we wanted. What we wanted more than anything else was to bring together the military, the political, and the social stories the way people lived them. Which meant we were now going to be telling a story about the Civil War where people were changing allegiances throughout the war. We were now going to be telling a story of the Civil War where it was chaotic and you never knew what was going to happen from one day to the next. There were no nice, neat turning points. Every single battle becomes more horrific than the last. We're talking about a conflict that, based on recent scholarship, is from 2011, where we used to say 620,000 people died, soldiers died. That number now is over 750,000, and it doesn't even include the civilian population. Now, the equivalent to that today would be, imagine how we would respond in our society if we lost 8 million soldiers in 4 years. That is the level of loss that this particular generation was dealing with. So you might understand why it took them so long to wrap their head around what to do with it. Why it took them, that, again, a significant amount of loss. Our storytelling had to highlight, again, complex individual choices. We had to share multiple perspectives. And by the way, for us, when we talk about multiple perspectives, and I had to make this really clear to people, when we're talking about multiple perspectives, we're talking about the people who lived during the period. I'm not talking about the foolishness that you're talking about today. First-person storytelling. I don't mean character interpretation here. But again, telling this very complex story through the lens of people who left it, because this is, for all intent and purpose, our first mass media war in the United States. So there are letters and diaries and quotes and family, journals, and they're among groups of people that you would not expect. There are photographic evidence. How many of you knew, for example, that 20 Native American nations would fight in the American Civil War? How many of you knew that? Right. We don't talk about them. 4 of those Native nations, Cherokee, Choctaw, White Creek, etc., and the Seminole, chose to fight for the Confederacy. Why? They're slave traders. They were slave trading nations as well. But we don't talk about that. We don't talk about, we don't talk about immigrant groups, Chinese, who were coming into California, finding a new way, and decide that they are going to make their way eastward to participate in this war. We aren't talking about the Mexicans who become a major threat to the Confederacy because they refused to sign a treaty similar to the Fugitive Slave Act, because you see, Mexico had abolished slavery in 1829. Any enslaved African American who made their way across the border for sanctuary, for freedom, got it, and got land. But we don't talk about that. You understand where I'm going here? You with me? Cool beans, because that's what we do. We have media that help bring this to life in really innovative ways. And we did something that we feel is really new and different. We emotionally map this exhibit. We deliberately manipulate our visitors' emotions. The exhibit is broken into 9 thematic areas. The red is where you see a high emotional content. The blue is more didactic to keep you in pace. These themes were selected because these are ideas and concepts that play out throughout the whole of the war, and they are anchored by year pillars, the little white dots you see. They're anchored by year pillars, but again, high emotional content. So when we're in the first area, the crisis of the Union, this is where we introduce right off the bat to our guests the diversity of faces that are involved in this conflict. Again, faces most of them had never seen before. We move them into resources for the war. You know, how do you pay for war? How do you ready for war? Because the United States only had about 1,000 standing, an army of only about 1,000 men when this starts. Confederacy didn't really have anything. But they built it quickly. And we became very efficient at killing each other, and so forth. So we go through this, and we share imageries, and we share stories, and we have found this to be the really fascinating piece that we're watching very closely. And by the way, we just opened last weekend. So I don't have all of that. Before you even step to the mic and ask me, well, what is your data telling you? We also made some deliberate choices about how we would connect. And this is where educators, classroom educators, helped us a lot. We did a series of focus groups prior to. We brought in educators, we brought in casual visitors, we brought in the Civil War buffs, and we said, hey, we're considering using these new scholastic digital scans that colorize, okay? Now, this is a process where the computer actually uses the varying gray scales that are in the original imagery and then extrapolates through an algorithm what the colors are. And it's reinforced by actual scholarship. So when they have like a white spot show up because they don't know what the color is, they will go to our collections to try to get a sample, right? But anyway, so here was an example. And the people who influenced us the most were the school teachers who told us every time we take our kids to museums and historic sites and they see color imagery, they completely check out. They told us that the kids emotionally disconnect because they think it happened so long ago it doesn't matter to them. So we said, wow, okay, well, what happens if the people look like them or people they know? What happens then? And we tried that out too. And the response to that was actually pretty remarkable. So we've deployed colorized imagery strategically. The other thing from our Civil War buffs we learned is that there are a lot of them who know this particular image extremely well, know it. Backward and forward. Yeah, that's when Lincoln sat down before he got ready to fire McClellan. Right? A lot of people know this image. But do they really? There were a number of things that appeared to us in the course of this image that most people were missing. The fact that you've got that captured flag, which we found out was actually in our collection. And several other details of that day, the heat of the sun that day, the time of day, things that become more apparent in this thing. So then we had the issue of where we were going to build it. Well, we operate 3 locations. We operate the White House of the Confederacy, which we will likely be changing the name because it was never called that in the period. That's what it was renamed in 1976 during a massive renovation and the decision to, they built a modern museum building in 76. It was the bicentennial, and they thought, hey, let's just have the White House have the Confederacy. And it was actually known as the Davis Residence, or the Executive Mansion was the actual name of it. But anyway, so we operate that site. We operate a museum in Appomattox that looks at the surrender and the early aftermath of the war and its impact in rural communities. And then our flagship institution is over at our historic Tredegar site. It's a 9-acre riverfront property that, it's just stunning. We have 5 original buildings on the site, and we have ruins of the first foundry there. So what we did, this idea of taking the old, embracing it, creating new and innovative ways to showcase, our architects worked very closely with this, and so we decided to actually do this. Build the museum around those arches. one of the most challenging preservation projects you can imagine, and an engineering thing, because by the way, the site was also in the floodplain. So what we did is we raised it up, sloped the property up. So these arches that you saw, there's actually now 4.5 feet below ground now, so that we were able to raise the flooring and visitors now walk through the archways to get into the building versus the way that it was before. We have preserved the industrial artifacts that were out front, and our collection storage and galleries are on the second level. Our main gallery is in the back, and a third of the building is actually underground, which provides a significant savings. So this building is fantastic. But we were talking about the exhibit. So I'm clicking, we're clicking. There we go. I want to show you this is a schematic, a digital makeup of it, of what it looks like. It's actually, again, open now, but this is us. That's a media piece over an exploded house. So, again, what we've done is to bring together all of these stories, again, the way people live them, in a visually engaging way that visitors can navigate. And what we've found after the first week is that they are completely taken aback in a positive way. What we are hearing exactly what we wanted to hear. I had no idea. I never thought about that before. That's not what I learned growing up. I have to come back. And those are the kinds of things that you want to hear. So with that said, I thank you for your time and attention, and I promise you, you can change the narrative and get it right, but you gotta be intentional in all things. Thank you. Now, clearly, because we started off kind of funny in the timing, they told me we'd still have Q&A, is that right? Okay, so there are microphones set here. If you have questions, we have at best 10 minutes. So hop to it. Anybody? Anybody? Good. Yeah, sure.
All right, everyone. So again, thank you, Chrissy. That was amazing. So I just want to give everyone also a little bit of time. We also do have some case studies happening alongside right outside of the hallway. So if you had any that you were planning on attending, please head to them right now. And then if not, if you want to stay for the Q&A, I already see someone queued up. We can go ahead and get started.
Thank you. Sure. All right. Yeah.
Started. Is this on?
It doesn't sound like it is. You want to click the,
You have Sam coming.
it was on. That one's on. Okay.
I was wondering how you are partnering with some of the other organizations that are in your kind of general area. And in particular, I was thinking of the national parks, which control a lot of the battle sites, and also Colonial Williamsburg and Jamestown, which, for better or for worse, kind of preserve an aspect the period preceding the Civil War, and whether you found that they're good partners or...
Excellent question. The question, for those of you that didn't hear in the moving, wants to know what other partnerships we have that exist with other museum partners in the Richmond region. And the answer is quite a few. So specifically, I will talk about the National Park Service. The Richmond National Battlefield Park and the Maggie Walker Historic Site, particularly the Richmond National Battlefield Park, they lease from the museum a building and operate their visitor center there. We partnered with them, the American Civil War Center, partnered with them on the site in 2011 to build the Civil War Gateway Center. The idea was to showcase all of the Civil War related sites throughout the Richmond region in that space, and to also draw attention to the battlefield sites and how to navigate them. So that was a partnership. So the idea was you come to the museum to get the backstory, and then you go out onto the fields and see how it played out. That was one of the other things that was critical to us for the exhibit, was that we had this marriage, again, as I said, of helping people understand this interconnection between military, political, and social. Because the decisions that are happening on the ground in the battlefield are going to impact political decision. They impact communities and how communities respond, which then influence politics and it was this constant movement, and we never or very rarely show it that way. Other partners that we have are the Virginia Museum of History and Culture, formerly known as the Virginia Historical Society. Rather than build an archive, because we have well over, actually we're well into the 200,000 archival pieces that were not ever properly digitized. So rather than build a whole new center for that and equipment and personnel, they have a robust and an outstanding program. So we entered into a 50-year agreement with them that they would do that, and then a special intellectual property agreement. As far as Colonial Williamsburg and Jamestown Yorktown Foundation, no. Yes.
Hi, is this on? Yeah, I think so. So I'm just interested to know, first of all, this is remarkable, and I'm sure I'm not alone when saying I would like to go there right away and experience it. But I'm curious to know, what is the long-term takeaway in a way that you want people to have? I understand that you've only been open a week, of course, but in your minds, you must have thought about, what is the long-term thing that you want people to do? Are you interested in sort of having all the museums that deal with this kind of topic begin to change their narratives? And what about the visitors? Like, is there something that you want them to do as a result of having been through the storytelling experience that you offer?
Great. Yes, the answer to that question is, everybody heard it? Okay. So the answer to that question in terms of what we want them to know, right? What do we want them to know when they leave? What do we want them to do? We don't expect them to know all of the stuff. What we do, however, want them to know is that, and what we want to be abundantly clear to them, is the simple narrative they were given becomes no longer acceptable. And I can give you just an example from an earlier period in my career when I was working for Colonial Williamsburg as Director of African American Programs at one point. And in 1990, just because this is the 25th anniversary of it, I have been reminded. In 1994, we took a program that the foundation had been doing all along called the estate sale. And we used character interpreters to show the casualness that human beings were being bought and sold at the same time that they were pulling the Burgesses together to decide whether they were going to send representatives to Philadelphia for freedom. Now that slave auction, as it became known, was a pivotal point. What did we want from it? We wanted people to understand the paradox of freedom and slavery in America's founding. The long-term impact of that and what we hope will happen at other historic sites. For this story, but what we found there was that other institutions like Mount Vernon and Heritage House and Monticello and Poplar Forest, what they came to us and said, God, if you guys can show that, we at least have to talk about the slaves on our properties. We at least have to get into this story. We at least have to do the work. So what I'm hoping is that there's a twofold piece here. What I'm hoping is that people's experience with us will continue to drive them to challenge other historic sites and their simple narratives. What I am hopeful is they feel empowered when they're done. And I know that that seems really lofty, but I've seen it work time and time again. I think there's only a handful of people that can go to a historic plantation site or something and be satisfied if not a word is mentioned about Black people. In fact, I think most people get really annoyed. I've watched it, right? They get really annoyed, like, well, you don't talk about that. Why don't you talk about that? Because they trust us. And if they think we aren't doing, I mean, you all may be familiar with this research, but Pew Charitable Trust does this survey about every 2 years, 2 to 3 years. And every single time they do it, museums rank number 2 as the most trusted public institutions. That is a significant amount of power, and we don't yield it. We don't yield it, and we don't let it go without, using it. I think we have a responsibility, and I'm so glad that we're getting out of this foolishness of thinking that museums are somehow objective institutions. We don't have to be activist institutions, but we have to be active in the communities we claim to serve. And if we have the resources, both in terms of people and archives or whatever, to help our communities navigate the very real things that they're doing, that is our responsibility. Because at the end of the day, history's never been for the dead. Next question. I'm sorry, go ahead.
That's okay. I just wanted to say thank you. Thank you for your presentation and your work. My question is more about kind of the ideological battles that were fought at the kind of beginning of this whole, because obviously you're bringing together 2 institutions with memberships who have very different ways of thinking about this past. And so I'm just curious if you can talk a little bit about kind of the battle for hearts and minds that had to happen behind the scenes, I guess, in addition, obviously, creating a space for things to be presented to the public. What it was like to kind of navigate the bridging of these 2 very different, very contradictory ideological spaces. I don't know if you've...
Right. So you can follow me at History Gone Wrong on Twitter, because I have started a thread called ACWM Merger, where I get into, now that we've 6 years past it actually happening, where I talk about this. In short, it wasn't as much of an issue for the internal leadership to come up. There were after doing, considerable time in SWOT analysis and really considering, because I'll be honest, when the idea was first brought to me, I said, no, there's no reason for us to do it. We're doing great, right? I don't have a problem. But I did. I didn't really have a strong collection. So the stories that we wanted to tell, we had no way of, we were going to have to borrow them anyway, right? And so, once I kind of got over myself, and our leadership team and said, we need to stop and just think about this for a minute. It became easier. It wasn't perfect, and there were some knockout dragouts, but we were all in that sort of very secret space. When we started expanding it to our management teams and talking about it, and I did that much earlier because of the way of our organizational culture, the organizational culture is the bigger problem. I'll be real honest with you. The center had a very young and when I say diverse, I mean every particular thing you can imagine we had. And our staff tended to be younger, and so did our audience. By like 20 years, our audience was younger than the MOC audience. So the expectations were different. They had people who had worked there straight out of college or had risen through the ranks and, that were on their team. And yes, they had older processes and they were very rigid in the way that they approached things. Whereas we had to be far more entrepreneurial because we didn't have an endowment. We didn't have, 57% of our revenues come off of our gate. For a history museum, that's absurd, right? But, we were hustling. We were, making it happen. So it was that mix. But the public, when it came time to the public, and we had to sit down and start doing pro forma, MOC acknowledged that they'd probably lose about 40% of their membership. We did not have a membership program. We just had an annual fund program. And it was pretty small. We had like 400 annual fund donors who contributed close to $600,000 a year. At that time. They had roughly 4,500 members and annual fund supporters that totaled around 700 a year. So there was a difference. So we planned for a decline of 40% as we made out the pro forma for the first few years, that people would just be too angry to get it. It ended up being about 43%. Because what I underestimated was that some of the liberal folk, as they were referred to, thought that we had just allowed ourselves to be usurped by the lost causers when we did the merger. So that was a piece that I had not anticipated well. I really had, of course it makes sense, but we've overcome that. We've haven't quite gotten back to those numbers, but the best part is we have new people that have joined the fore, and it's great. It's great. Yes.
Thank you. Yeah, that's fascinating. And I don't suppose you have students visiting yet, but I'm curious to hear your kind of plan for interpretation for working with teachers and school field trips. I assume you're going to start with the Civil War.
Well, again, we've operated 3 sites since this. We didn't stop operating our museums just because we merged. We did when we merged. Immediately, we merged in 2014. We had new mission in place by 2014 and 2015. So we had redesigned all of our programs. What we didn't have was this new space. So the previous galleries, everything was redone. Even the storytelling and the tours for the White House of the Confederacy was redone, because you see, that's a 200-year-old house that also served as the Freedmen's Bureau, that also served as the headquarters for the Military District No. 1 of the United States government, which was also the Broken Bow House. So it had a much richer history that we had a chance to tell. So we had become the new museum then. We just got the new museum building now. Okay, so school groups have always been coming. And we have a standing teachers advisory committee that people serve on for 2 years and rotate through, and it's 13 members from the 9 districts that surround the Richmond region, and they meet once a month with us to review educational content, program, tour outcomes, all of those things to make sure that we're in sync with what's happening. We also, by the way, our education team, this kind of back to our larger question, when I talked about using your resources to help, we also are very involved now with the state's Department of Education, because the SOLs are going to be reviewed, as are the textbooks. We are not being reactionary again. We have chosen to be on the front line of that so that those either or options and things that were there before are gone, and that we're actually able to influence that. And these teachers are helping us in that process too. And so when you have that sort of buildup of support and again, activism that is there, we also do teacher workshops, one-on-one. We do Civil War one-on-one for educators. Those ideas of the pre and post visit study packet, stop wasting your time. Teachers don't have time for that. Instead, use those resources and that time that you're blowing with that. I'm just telling you, they don't have time. They don't have time. So instead, our way to help the teachers is we do Civil War one-on-one. They come and spend a day with us. If they really want to get into it and want to have packets of material available to them, then they come to our Teachers Institute. But we provide this quick and easy way for them to learn their subject, because many of them, especially the elementary school teachers, they didn't major in this stuff. They have no idea. They are going by whatever the textbook tells them, and half of them are wrong. So as educators, I hope you can appreciate the power that you have if you choose to wield it. Last question?
Hi.
I think. Did you have a question behind her? No? Okay, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Hi, building off several of these questions and also my own experience working for an organization that primarily uses primary sources, how does the museum address historiography, like the history of the history of the narratives around the Civil War, excerpts from textbooks and secondary sources outlining the Civil War and kind of the change through time of what voices have been heard and how it's been edited?
Do we deal with historiography? Not really. Not really. If we do, it tends to be more on our, through the varying series that we offer in terms of public programming. We essentially have 5 sets of public programs at the museum. We have the traditional book talks, where we are bringing in academics and new releases, and, we may do some stuff there. We have another program called the Foundry Series, which is a very deliberate one for current contemporary issues with a historical tie to it. So for example, we did, this year we did a program looking at the opioid crisis in the Civil War era and how it impacted soldiers coming home, right? And we paired up with veteran substance abuse partners to do those programs. We have History Happy Hour. No, you may not steal the name. History Happy Hour is where we reach out, basically take the museum to the community, and we go to popular bars and locations around the city, and and also out in Appomattox and Charlottesville in our Western Place. And we bring in an academic or a guest lecturer who talks about the things that are often you don't talk about in the presence of children related to the war. You know what I'm talking about. So, and those have proven to be among our most popular programs. I mean, hundreds of people come out and drink. And our tag is, you buy the liquor, we'll bring the history. And so we talk about those things that are admittedly a little bit more salacious. We talk about the rise of prostitution and how up to 5% of the female population turned to sex work during the war to support themselves and their families. We talk about, STDs and what 10% of the armies at any one time, the soldiers are laid up because they got something, So we do those kinds of programs. I talked about the institutes and the series that we do for educators. And then, all of that is not dealing directly with the historiography, but the the person who is engaging with the visitor can do that, because that question will inevitably come up. I never learned this when I was a kid, or I have never heard of this before. And that's where the actual object and the quote from the person who the lived experience is so helpful, because they have that right there in front of them to see. But yeah, we don't, we really don't dig that much into it. That's not our space. That's academic space. As public historians, our job is to bridge the divide between the academic community and the public. That's our job. So historiography, when it becomes important to share, we do. But it is not a part of the primary experience, because guess what? Libraries are number one, museums are number two. So they're going to give us that benefit of the doubt. We better get it right, is all I'm saying. Thank you all so much for your time and attention.